America is back in the thick of COVID rows as President Biden's political honeymoon is well and truly over. The zero COVID countries are fighting a possibly losing battle to keep the Delta variant at bay, and extreme weather events hit southern Europe, leading to yet more instances of multiple wildfires. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. President Joe Biden cheerfully admitted that he was taking action that was almost certainly not legal this week. It's a remarkable testament to the crisis facing Americans' institutions and the incredibly bad shape the country is in as it tries to pull itself out of the pandemic. The specific issue is to do with the extension of the moratorium on landlords being able to evict tenants that haven't paid their rent. This was a measure that was brought in originally under Trump in September 2020, providing what was meant to be temporary protection to tenants who, because of the pandemic, weren't able to make those rental payments. Then it was extended again, and in June this year, the Supreme Court ruled that although the CDC's moratorium would be permitted to run to the end of July, any future extensions would be in the hands of Congress. Seems pretty clear? Well, Joe Biden announced that the CDC was to extend the moratorium anyway. As he did so, he conceded that the bulk of constitutional scholars had said that such a move would be found not to be legal, but he said he'd do it anyway because it would take time for that to go through the courts. By the time he got struck down, he'd have been able to help a bunch of people in the meantime. That has been a somewhat controversial take. The idea that the executive should knowingly take an initiative that it's been advised is not legal, not constitutional, but do it anyway. I mean, it's brought up a lot of traditional themes in the United States about executive overreach. Mainstream news outlets like CNN praise the move, however, waving aside the niceties like this. President Biden shows he's ready to make drastic moves in the COVID-19 fight, even if he's not sure they're legal. And that linked to this article, which says this: even President Joe Biden doesn't know whether his new federal eviction moratorium for renters is legal and sustainable. But crushing humanitarian and political pressure left him no choice but to take a chance on an emergency move. Why, the man's practically Batman, the dark vigilante shrugging off the niceties of the law in the quest for justice. Commentators on the right have speculated how those reporters at CNN would have reported this move had it been former President Trump who'd announced that he was knowingly passing a measure that was not constitutional. I mean, regardless of your politics, it does seem a fair question to ask. It's true to say that Biden isn't the first recent president to push beyond the bounds. Even his supporters acknowledge that Barack Obama did it in a number of areas, and Trump did it as well when it suited him. But this action is that much more blatant in cheerfully admitting that it's illegal, but it's worth doing anyway. Now, let's be fair, it's done to avoid a bad situation. Of course, it's true to say many renters, up to 11 million, are in serious arrears because of COVID, and if their landlords decided to, they could be evicted. Why are they in that situation? They were supposed to be supported by the $47 billion Emergency Rental Assistance Program. But to date, that has only successfully paid out $3 billion. Both tenants and landlords have complained that gaining access to the money has been slow and bureaucratic and difficult. So while all of that gets delayed, renters and landlords have been facing problems. Some renters have been facing a potential cliff edge where they're going to get turfed out. But then, on the other hand, many landlords, including a lot of small businesses and individuals, have to continue paying mortgages and repairs on properties that have been providing no income. And then, of course, you get the stories about the wealthy tenants spending money on luxury goods while not paying their rent and all of that. If you're inclined to push one side or the other, there's always hard luck cases that will be able to support your argument. Presumably, though, if the government had been able to efficiently disperse the funds that had been agreed, this would be a non-problem. So while CNN may be singing his praises for taking decisive, unconstitutional action, and maybe that was the pragmatic thing to do given where things have got to, it sets horrible precedents and should have been unnecessary. Unsurprisingly, it's being immediately challenged in the courts. Landlords and real estate companies have asked a federal judge to block the move. And it's just another blow to Biden's standing as the COVID crisis rumbles on long past the time when the country has gotten heartily sick of it and it thought it was rid of it. The country feels like it's been climbing a mountain with the peak in sight, nearly attained, only to get there and find out actually there's another peak and there's a lot further to go. This is now on Biden. During the election, he claimed that if he'd been president rather than Trump, all those people would not have died of COVID. I criticised that when he said it. It was extraordinary hubris. When you looked across the world, saw leaders struggling everywhere. I mean, even the ones that did best rarely could make that sort of a claim. Then, very early on in his presidency, he declared responsibility for victory. The vaccination progress was winning the fight, all because of him. In May, the CDC declared job done, and double vaccinated people now no longer needed to wear masks, and that was reinforced on Independence Day by the president saying this: "Today, all across this nation, we can say with confidence, America is coming back together. Today, while the virus hasn't been vanquished, we know this: it no longer controls our lives. It no longer paralyses our nation, and it's within our power to make sure it never does so again." Well, that statement aged extremely badly. One public health expert, Lena Wen, told the Hill website this: "Of course, there are other reasons we are seeing this surge, but the primary reason is that people thought this pandemic was over." Why is that the case? It was the Biden administration's own messaging. And so it was, just as normality was offered, and just as we see numerous times in the UK, this happened. And not only did the government reverse course, it did so badly. Al Tompkins of the Poynter Institute said that the CDC made a hash of its recent reversal on masking guidance. The White House, and the CDC in particular, did a miserable job last week. The data in Massachusetts ended up having to leak out, which made it look like something nefarious was going on. That's just a miserable way to share information from an administration that said it was going to be transparent. The problem for Biden is that there's nowhere to hide. If you've quickly taken the credit for the early improvement in COVID cases, then you can't turn around and blame Trump when it turns out that it's taking longer than you said it was going to. You can't promise in the election that you're going to fix the problem and then escape the blame when the problem refuses to get fixed. I mean, you could have. If you'd avoided the hubris in the first place, if you'd been honest about how little impact policy would have, that this could be a long-haul thing, and that's because governments can't guarantee to protect you from a virus. Not when it's headed by Trump, not when it's headed by Biden. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Biden's approval rating has dropped by 10% as the mask mandates return, and particularly since surging inflation, which it was suggested was almost certainly going to be short-lived, looks like it might not be short-lived. Apparently Democrats are reporting from the focus groups and the surveys that were the midterm elections to be held right now, Democrats would get a pounding and easily lose control of both houses. The key thing, they argue, is that the administration needs to sharpen up its message. Well, the problem, of course, is that it's caught between the radicals on the one side, the moderates on the other, who deeply disagree what sharpening that message up would actually look like. Largely because they deeply disagree with what the policy substance behind the messaging should be in the first place. Now, in a minute, we'll get on to a roundup of the rest of the week's news. But first, I have celebrated the dynamics of meritocracy here on this channel. Those who work hard, who focus on doing quality work, they have the best chance of rising up from their current circumstances and succeeding. It's what the American dream is made of. And when we talked about whether America is systemically racist, it's what questioned that narrative most powerfully, because groups that embrace the logic of meritocracy, notably Asians, perform well, and those instead who imbibe a culture of victimhood generally don't. Is it really as simple as that? In his book, The Tyranny of Merit, Michael Sandel attacks the idea of meritocracy and argues that it's actually at the heart of why America, and the UK too, by the way, are polarised and why their systems are doomed to fail. Now, I came to this book because I expected it to be a challenge to one of my prior beliefs, which, as you know, I tried to seek out. I wasn't holding out high hopes from the title. but it well exceeded my expectations. Gives some real food for thought for anyone trying to make sense of the world as we currently experience and understand it. So I will be looking at those arguments and those ideas in my video to go live next Monday. Is our polarised and degraded politics all down to the tyranny of merit? Join me for that, going live 7 p.m. UK time. While Western countries are imperfectly and bad-temperedly opening up, Asia is hovering on the edge of a new wave of COVID infections that could, if it develops over the coming few days, push back economic recovery in an important 1/3 of the world. Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia have been the focus. The figures from Indonesia offer some hope that these are about to peak. But the big question is what becomes of the countries that have to date been following successful zero COVID policies. Between China, Australia and New Zealand, the countries that have been doing the best in terms of avoiding the worst of COVID disruption. Now, of course, China's the big beast, currently embattled with the arrival of a more infectious Delta variant. China's previous successful strategy, which is massive authoritarian lockdown and mass testing at the first detection of any cases, this was heralded by Xi Jinping as the mark of the superiority of the Chinese political system. The problem with this, as for all the zero COVID cases, is that it depends on rapid success, because once you've lost control of it, even draconian measures are likely to fail. And it seems possible that lost control of it they have. The country's seen nearly 1,400 cases since early July, and it's been spreading, reaching more than half of China's 31 provinces. Right now, the authorities are playing the massive response card, hoping that it might just be enough. All 11 million residents of Wuhan are being tested, along with similar testing regimes in a number of other cities. Domestic flights are being suspended. Strict quarantine times are being set for people that have been in contact with anyone infected. And just in case too much information should get out of the wrong sort, it has also launched a crackdown on citizen journalists who post information on Weibo and WeChat. But some academics within China had started to talk about the fact that coexistence with COVID-19 was going to be required in the long term because ultimately it is now endemic across the world, so keeping it out forever becomes pretty much impossible. China's challenge is that it's something of an open question how vulnerable its citizens are to the virus. In common with other countries that had successfully kept a zero COVID policy in action, take-up of vaccinations had been relatively slow, at least at first. The absence of circulating virus in the community means that people don't have a high sense of urgency. Now that has ramped up recently, and it took just 5 days to administer an additional 100 million doses, and it now records that 1.7 billion doses have been administered overall. The challenge, though, is that the Chinese manufactured vaccines have been found elsewhere to offer significantly less protection than some of the others. Some countries that had taken the Chinese donations of vaccine had found they were less effective, and that had been confirmed by several academic studies, finding fewer antibodies produced in people vaccinated with either of the China vaccines. Now, less protection doesn't mean no protection, so it remains to be seen how events will unfold. And by the way, whatever you think about the origin of COVID-19 and the possible culpability of the Chinese Communist Party about how the virus got into the world, let's just agree that ordinary Chinese people who have to live under that government don't deserve to get COVID any more than anybody else does. Political punishments for Chinese decision makers may well be appropriate if it were to be proven that they covered up a lab leak. That proof may be getting a little bit closer, maybe, with the news that the US intelligence agencies have obtained by means unknown what's described as a treasure trove of genetic data arising from virus samples that have come from the Wuhan virology lab. Making sense of the raw data is going to take time because it turns out there's a rather limited number of scientists on hand who have a sufficient security clearance and who speak Mandarin Chinese and who are skilled at interpreting complex genetic sequencing. I wouldn't be surprised if that was like just one person, working 18-hour days for the next 3 months or something. Meanwhile, China has been responding to recent attacks on this score by doubling down on spreading its own suggested version that the virus actually emerged from the US Research Institute at Fort Detrick in Maryland. And it's even called upon the WHO to conduct an investigation there. And it's organised a 25 million signature letter to support that call. Meanwhile, back to zero COVID countries fighting infections, Australia, the second such country, is in a similar battle, with an extended Sydney lockdown and 262 cases recorded in New South Wales overall. And the citizens in Melbourne, mostly wearily, some angrily, once again pushed into strict lockdown. The fears there are that the draconian lockdown measures that contained COVID at the start are not going to hold against the Delta variant. Even more so than China, vaccination rates have been slow, with just 16% of the population fully vaccinated, and with zero COVID having been the default reality for most of the previous period, that's a lot of people vulnerable to infection. In retrospect, a zero COVID policy can only really make sense if a country uses the valuable time it's bought itself by prioritising vaccination in advance of the border defences eventually being breached. In the UK, it feels like we've been on a long journey, but right now the rate of new infections continues to decline, in spite of the most recent relaxation of lockdown. Government continues to obsessively tweak policy on an almost daily basis, leading to confusion and chaos, but at least some of the tweaking this week has been the inevitable reining back in of some of the most egregious mistakes made in previous weeks. So they've adjusted the settings for the NHS app that had led to the pingdemic, so that it will now only ping you if someone you met in the last 2 days reports COVID, not the last 5 days. Whether this comes in time or not remains to be seen. I'm seeing a number of reports of people saying that some of the key supply chains are just on the verge of complete breakdown. The construction industry, for instance, is reporting shortages of building materials and contractors, which is holding back on-site work. Government also pulled back on the widely attacked plans to make the travel restrictions even more complicated with a amber watch list. And it's put a few more countries onto the green list, while, shoving Mexico onto the red list, with the usual story of giving an absurdly tight deadline, so people who are currently on holiday there have to get back in a hurry or else fork out shed loads of cash to stay in a quarantine hotel. And of course there aren't enough places on the flights to get all those people back in time, so you're just dumping on them basically and making their lives miserable. It has been just a catastrophically appalling period of missteps, constant interference in people's lives, wholly out of proportion of the measures you might need to take. Not that it's never appropriate to take measures, but the day-to-day adjustment, the lurching from one ill-considered initiative to another, springing surprises on people, only to then U-turn when the consequences start to pile up. His former aide, Dominic Cummings, described Boris Johnson as a shopping trolley whose wonky wheels cause it to lurch sideways randomly. And it's hard not to see that as a description of government policy in action right now. This is probably one reason why, even amongst conservative activists, Boris Johnson's satisfaction rating has plummeted in recent weeks. That's mirrored then in the country at large, as this poll by Politico shows. Although the Prime Minister's unpopularity has perhaps influenced the narrowing of the gap between the two main political parties, the opposition haven't yet been able to turn that into a poll lead. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, the ongoing global relay race of extreme weather has handed the baton onto southern Europe, where intense heatwave conditions have led to a stronger than usual season of wildfires. Turkey's Mediterranean coastline has been dotted with a significant number of out-of-control fires, made worse, according to locals, by what they've described as the government's slow and lacklustre response, added to ongoing incompetent management from the forestry department. The ancient Greek site of Olympia is under threat, as around 100 wildfires per day have ripped across that country. Greece was nudging the underside of record temperatures over the last few days, and that followed a period of drought that has made this year's fires worse than usual. And the same again for Italy, where regions have seen tens of thousands of hectares of forest burnt. In Sardinia, there's been decimation of antique olive groves and other sites rich in biodiversity. All of these countries are used to seeing wildfires at this time of year. But the heat and the dry conditions are just an indicator of the extreme end of that may become normalised over the future decades. Investment in more firefighting equipment, tightening up on forest management, all of those things are going to be a key part of adapting to the future, which of course is not much comfort to the people who are in the heat of this right now. In other news, YouTube gave Sky News Australia a strike on their YouTube channel at the end of last week. That was for posting opinion content that was held to be against the platform's community guidelines, including debates around whether masks are effective against COVID-19 and whether lockdowns are justified. The channel had covered commentators with opinions on both sides of those debates, but it turned out that some of them were opinions that we needed to be protected against. Also this week, as I mentioned in my video already on Wednesday, YouTube also took down Rebel Wisdom's video, where they interviewed 3 different people in relation to ivermectin, specifically advocate Tess Lawrie, which is where I suspect the problems arose. There were different views expressed, and the interviewer David Fuller challenged each of the interviewees with the arguments of the other side. It was as balanced a piece of journalism as you'll find in many ways. There's been an open question about this because some of the previous videos that have been taken down by YouTube were of advocates given a platform to argue their case where they were largely unchallenged. So the question was, do these discussions pass the nanny knows best filter if they're presented in a traditional journalistic fashion with challenge? And the answer initially was no. But then on appeal, I note that the video has now reappeared. So maybe it did pass a balance test. This is like English case law, where you clarify the law by potentially breaking it, which then forces a case and a decision. You might think there would be a better way to manage this sort of process. Because, as David Fuller himself points out, if you aim to suppress arguments, they just get given more credibility, not less. They will appear somewhere in the independent media space. So that traditional gatekeeping role that the mainstream media wants to play simply isn't possible, never mind whether or not it's even desirable. Interestingly, we had it confirmed this week that it also sometimes doesn't play the other way. Just because you push a message doesn't mean that people respond to it in a way that you'd like them to. Research was published to show that graphic warning labels on cigarette packets about the health impacts of smoking, those had no impact on whether and how much people smoked. And that's a remarkable thing, right? Because over the years they've been making those labels more and more graphic, trying desperately to shock people into noticing them and then reflecting on the message. But no, nagging, labelling, nudging and prodding. Maybe you can do it effectively in the context of a pandemic, but it seems that nanny state manipulation doesn't necessarily follow through into influencing our daily habits. Now look, personally I think it would be a good thing if people who realised that they should probably quit smoking were helped more effectively to do so. But I nevertheless take comfort from the fact that government-funded psychologists haven't yet gotten so masterful at pulling our levers that we're simply helpless before them, falling in line with whatever the current approved behaviours might be. Now in a minute we'll go to the final thought for the week. But first, August is the holiday season, so if I do a live stream next week, will there be anyone around to watch it? Well, let's find out. If nobody's there, it'll be good practice for me for when I'm old and senile and wandering down the road muttering to myself in an animated and slightly odd fashion. We will cover some thoughts about topical issues of the day, and if you're there, I will respond to your questions via the chat. Let's do it, even if you have to tune in from a beach in Miami or wherever you happen to be. Live stream Wednesday next week, 7 p.m. UK time. Join me then. Last week, scientists came out and stated that the new generation of climate models are running too hot, and this had to be acknowledged and dealt with. I sort of predicted this last year in my video that was prompted by the Guardian's catastrophist headline inspired by exactly those sorts of results. I'd wondered then if we were approaching a crisis point with how such models are developed. And I said this: if so, it will be a real test for the integrity of the climate science community, how well it responds to that challenge. Will scientists simply circle the wagons and defend the models at all costs, or will they embrace the harder questions about the challenge of taking this to the next level? Admitting uncertainty of any sort is hard. Admitting uncertainty in a polarised world is even more so. Because in that situation, there are people just waiting to jump on any such admissions, to misrepresent them, and rather than celebrating your candour, instead to damn you for what they will perhaps describe as your incompetence. But now it seems that the scientists have come out to take the risk, and it seems as though maybe, of course, it took them longer than perhaps it should have done, but ultimately, even knowing that some are going to jump all over this, they're going to do it anyway, to acknowledge the problem and to face up to it. The real failure is pretending certainty where that doesn't exist. In a different context, we saw an example of this recently: Neil Ferguson making another prediction about how the numbers of infections would shoot up following the UK fully coming out of lockdown. And then we saw the exact opposite happening before our very eyes. And of course, various people mocked him for being wrong, suggested it's just the latest in a pattern of him always being wrong. But it was the American veteran statistician Nate Silver who highlighted the real issue. And he said this: "I don't care that the prediction is wrong. I'm sure this stuff is hard to predict. It's that he's consistently so overconfident." Philip Tetlock, the author of Super Forecasters, agreed and added that when smart forecasters are consistently overconfident, you should start suspecting that they're motivated by something other than pure accuracy, such as publicity or policy advocacy, which of course is exactly what people suspect is what motivates false certainty on the details of some of the climate models. The knowledge that there are people wanting to exploit uncertainty to argue that because we don't know everything, it must mean that we know nothing, that is warping how we talk about these issues. You create the incentive to ignore nuance and uncertainty in scientific messaging on the basis then that the public policy ends will justify the means. But people notice. That approach is likely one factor why a number of people will now simply not trust what they're told by experts, full stop. And I get the temptation. I found myself that the mere act of stating that the evidence isn't yet conclusive, say on something like ivermectin, can provoke backlash from those for whom any expression of doubt is taken as a values-based attack on them. We're seriously not going to come through this period in good shape if we can't work our way to coping with uncertainty. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will be giving us the next test next week, I expect, when it releases its latest report, Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. It's a summary of the published research, which we already know about, but I expect that's not how the headlines are going to read, nor will it be how the discussion is going to go. Well, we'll have to see. All right. As you'll have seen, I've moved the replying to comments section to the Wednesday videos, since those are more explicitly themed from now on as discussion focused, so it made sense for them to be there, not here. And that means I can get a bit more news into these episodes, so hopefully you found that to your taste this time. If not, let me know in the comments below. As always, my thanks go to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to that support, I'm able to spend the time researching and producing videos, and I feel free to focus on the topics that really matter, regardless of whether YouTube wants such topics monetized or not, or even on the channel or not. We're constantly seeing videos being removed for saying something or another that YouTube doesn't approve of. That hasn't happened to me yet. So imagine if I'd been thinking that I needed to self-censor myself, and I just therefore hadn't dared to do half of them. And that's how it works, not just for direct censorship, the ripple effect of the chilling of free speech, because the rules are not clearly spelt out, not consistently enforced. If you would like to help me to continue make these videos by taking your place in the growing community of Patreon supporters, please head over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, What are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.